Good afternoon, Sherene. How are you?
Hi, Bassam. I'm okay, hanging in there.
I am very happy to be speaking with you. We have known each other for many decades, and this is a very difficult time, but we are actually doing this. This is what we have learned. We usually ask scholars and journalists and thought leaders and researchers what they think about five things, five items that they select, and they have 5 minutes for each. But before we get into that, let me just ask you, how are you doing, Kifik?
I'm okay. I mean, it's a kind of a relentless roller coaster of darkness this last year, but somehow deeply intensified in the last couple of months, expanded and intensified in new ways. And I think the lack of any end in sight is very difficult to confront. I'll say more about what I think sort of the balance between precision and its lack might mean for us as we think about power moving forward, state power, non-state power. But I think in this moment, it's a time of both immense loss at the same time that we are really clear about and I think it's Maureen Rabbani who has said this really powerfully, that Israel can kill leaders, but they can't kill movements. And I think that's been what's occupied me the most in this period. The immense amount of targeted assassinations that we've witnessed, and um, and also, I think it's important to note that what we witnessed yesterday with Yahya Sinwar was not, in fact, a targeted assassination, and that itself will be historic. That it was that Sinwar fell in battle, in combat, and so I think. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of just beyond my capacity for analysis and in its kind of relentlessness at the same time that there are clear moments of rupture and change in this period that I still haven't made sense of, and I don't think many of us have.
Sherene, I'm going to ask you five questions. And the first question that you have selected is actually Israel. What have we learned in the past year about Israel? And you can approach it in any way, shape, or form.
I've been thinking a lot about kind of something that I used to think a lot about being in Egypt post the Arab uprisings, which is the deep and weak state. And with Israel, I have been thinking a great deal in this year and watching and observing with tremendous grief and rage the um, simultaneous kind of immense military power with this kind of unhinged level of impunity. At the same time that we're learning again and again that this seemingly hermeneutically sealed capacity, be it military or technology, is actually much more vulnerable, fragile, and dependent than we had previously imagined. I think in the last 2 months in particular, we've seen Israel's capacity to reshape its tactics of precision and infiltration. But even in these moments of reshaping, we are also seeing these kinds of that the mask of impenetrability has fallen off. And so this seems to be a real breaking moment in the long-held belief that Israel put out to the world of invincibility, kind of couched in this long strategy of Ben-Gurionism, which had originally kind of taken shape with its namesake as the strategy of hitting the enemy both preemptively and so hard so as to constantly convince the enemy of their military inferiority. And I think we have seen moments where that approach has been punctured in multiple different places and sites. And so I think the lesson here about Israel is once again to find the balance between overestimating and underestimating its power. And I think this is the calculation that is really at stake in this moment. How do we make sense of this immense power of the sole nuclear power in the Middle East and North Africa, and how also do we come to understand its vulnerability?
Thanks, Sherene. We will move now to a very related topic, and that is Zionism, which is the second item. And of course, in all of these items, there's a lot to address. Feel free to approach things the way you see fit. What have we learned in this past year, now actually a little bit more than a year, about Zionism?
We've always known that ideology is dynamic and perpetually shifting and in conversation with the conditions around it. And similarly, we've known that since its inception, Zionism has had many internal tensions. One of those internal tensions that has informed both its form and content is, the question of its ambition. So, was the ambition of Zionism, like some would claim, to be a light onto the nations, or was it to be a nation like any other? And I think that this tension between the exceptional and the common, like everybody else, is a kind of window onto this moment and what we've learned about Zionism in this last year, a moment in which we witness the consolidation of this explicit, prevailing, and ubiquitous extremism that characterizes Israel today, this kind of genocidal logic that I know Diana Buttu has really talked about in this series. And I think here I've been thinking a lot also about how we've come to understand liberalism and both its historical trajectory and in the moment we're living its crisis now. And I've been thinking about the insistence of some Zionist thinkers and founding figures and sort of their investment in individual rights and civil liberty, democracy, and how that insistence was from the very beginning in this mutually constituting relationship to settler colonial practice and theory. And here again is a kind of informing second tension of Zionism, which is that from the 1880s, with its first wave of settlement in Palestine, Zionism's kind of brand of liberalism, let's say, had always been contingent on exclusion, on the idea that some people were deserving of land, of nation, and of peoplehood, while other people were not. So this hierarchy of civilizational categories. And so Zionism's primary problem from its inception and I think this is what's changed. So its primary problem from its inception has been how to create a Jewish and democratic state in a land where most people were not Jewish. And so it seems now that in this moment of genocide, we might trace Zionism as a kind of case study, a laboratory of and in which ideas of the liberal and ideas of liberalism are kind of co-constituting with settler colonialism to shape forms of exclusion, extermination, and necro-political supremacy. And I think, with this last point, I think I was kind of just trying to survey, in preparing for today, and I was reminded of this group who set up a giant bouncy castle at the entrance where aid trucks were supposed to pass at Kerem Abu Salim, the crossing into Gaza this last summer. And the organizer of this celebration had urged others to kind of join the party. And, he sort of said, get ready, there will be inflatables, cotton candy, popcorn, plushies. And at around the same time, this last summer, we saw near Al-Khalil, near Hebron, Israelis attacking trucks of food coming from Jordan and heading to Gaza, a place that we know has been subject to a regime of starvation, Israeli starvation. And so we were witness to these scenes of, people throwing packages of food onto the road, ripping open bags of grain, setting trucks on fire. And I think these actions speak to the desire for more Palestinian death, more pain, more hunger. But they also broadcast the impunity and popularity of a genocide. And I'm thinking a lot about the spectacle of necro-political supremacy and its relationship to the premises of liberalism in a settler colonial condition. So in this case, the spectacle of necro-political supremacy was so blatant that even U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had called it a total outrage.
Thank you, Sherene. Let me ask you to address a very thorny topic, considering that so many of us live in the United States and are witnessing an unprecedented, not just complicity, but more than complicity in Israel's genocide by the United States. Complicity is sort of the minimum one can say. And there's a lot to talk about. There are many, many angles. So this is a difficult one, but I would like to hear, and I'm sure a lot of people would like to hear your take on what have we learned in the past year about the United States that we may not have actually known quite well prior.
In some ways, I think we've seen the complete hollowing out of the possibility of establishment politics in the United States. And here, I also think the question of necropolitical supremacy looms large. And I think the two-party system, the electoral college, as you said, the intense participation across the spectrum of establishment elite figures in the genocide have really gone far to make very clear the hollowing out of the possibility of these kinds of politics. And so basically we are now facing a choice between neoliberal genocidaires and neo-fascist genocidaires. Essentially, this is our choice. And I understand that there is a third party and, the Green Party, who have been, for the most part, excluded from any kind of national platforming that would make them, I think, viable candidates. And so I think this system is really, I think the way that I've come to understand it is that it's mired in this kind of necropolitical logic that seems really only to expand. And I think the depths of the how vapid this system is was really on display in both national conventions over the summer. And I think, watching the Republican National Convention was basically an exercise in, being witness to fear mongering, this kind of festival of fear mongering and fear, and inspired by fear and mongering fear. And I think, the kind of neo-fascist realities of that were really terrifying. But I think then the way that, the Democratic National Convention started peddling in this kind of decadent and offensive and also empty rhetoric of joy, silencing not just Palestinians, but the very idea of Palestine, just as the party itself was and continues to be taking part in this relentless, brutal genocide, for me, really just punctured the possibility of anything meaningful coming out of this process. And here too, I think we have to think about how various forms of what is liberalism or what it has given birth to, especially with regards to how race, gender, sexuality have been kind of incorporated into these establishment projects, are really going to be something we have to think long and deep about, for a long time, and really deeply about, to understand what kind of horizons do we have in the future.
I'm trying to take it in. We've done a number of these, and everyone says, "What have I not said so far?" And I keep saying the continuation of the genocide and the killing and the mayhem and the absolute impunity is something that calls for repetition, expansion, more profound articulation of the same thing, given that it keeps happening, the same thing keeps happening. So sometimes there are no words. Thanks, Sherene. And now we would like to move to the most important point of all, if you will, and that is the Palestinians. What have we learned in this past year about Palestinians? And you can
Well, before that, I had a few things about the responsibility for the genocide, if you wanted to talk about
Do you want to
that.
do that before?
Yeah, yeah, let's
Absolutely.
do.
We can
Let's.
move to your last point. Well, at least in terms of the listing, responsibility for this genocide before we go to the Palestinians. What have we learned in terms of responsibility for this genocide for the past year?
This is something I've written a bit about for the Journal of Palestine Studies in my editor's notes. And this is something that I think for those of us in the university context and in, the people who are doing this kind of work, like yourself, Bassam, and everybody that you uplift, which is producing knowledge. And I've been thinking a great deal about the role of Nakba denialism in this moment, and how Nakba denialism is really crucial to the ongoing brutality of the genocide. And I think Nakba denialism, denying the Nakba, is as old as the Nakba itself. And I think we have historic and ongoing forms of it. I think we have seen it, and we continue to see it in the U.S. and British and French and Canadian media. And so here I want to, in particular, remind us of the kind of brutal acrobatics in sites like the Atlantic, that where we've seen arguments that it is, quote, possibly possible to kill children legally. We see it in the New York Times, and there are style guidelines that restricted the use of the terms genocide and ethnic cleansing. We see it in the way that they instructed journalists to avoid using the phrase occupied territory when describing Palestinian land. We've seen this kind of Nakba denialism in the highest spaces of learning in North America, Western Europe, and far beyond, where administrators, courts, and governments are basically ordering academics to ignore the historical record, the UN, the ICC, the ICJ. And the proponents of Nakba denialism are really kind of moving from everyday speech and thought to the highest courts of international law. And so we saw this as well with the joint investigation of 972 local call and the Guardian, when they revealed that Israel had been sort of surveying senior ICC officials and Palestinian human rights workers for over a decade. Right, we saw this with Israel's surveillance of organizations like Al-Haq as terrorist organizations. And so I think, and we've talked a lot about this, Bassam, you and I, sort of how futile it feels to be producing knowledge at this time. And I think that that's a critical set of questions that we have to always engage. At the same time, I'm always struck by how the very word Palestine becomes a source of threat. Just saying the word, claiming and insisting on the genocide, insisting on the Nakba. And I think here we really have to take this lesson very closely as we continue the battle, as we continue our attempts to fight for Palestinian freedom, which is to say that a central component of conducting a genocide is denying it. And here I think, I will quote the words of the first Jewish American staffer, Lily Greenberg Call, who was one of the staffers who publicly resigned from the present U.S. administration, when she said Biden has the blood of innocent people on his hands. And I think all of these venues and places and courts who have been so invested in Nakba denialism also have the blood of innocent people on their hands.
I have so many things to say, and I'm trying to say less because we've done several of these, and I am always tempted to say a lot more. But the one thing I just want to comment on is not on what you said, is the actual length of time this partnership in genocide and complicity in genocide, depending on the tiers of support, right? I mean, there's the US, of course, up top, and then there's a lot of, or a few European states. The length of time that this will continue to be in our sort of psyche, on our minds, in public discourse. So I guess we will see, but something tells me that because of the unprecedented documentation of this genocide, things that in the past used to sort of fade away a bit more easily or in a quicker fashion are not going to fade away as fast.
Well, do you remember, Bassam, you always told me this Syrian saying that when the snow melts, I can't say bad words, but the poop appears.
Poop is the right word. Yes.
Yeah. And I think this is what I was trying to get at with the kind of vulnerability and impunity, like the power and the fragility, which is that I think so much has been revealed in this moment. I've said this before, with you, in conversation with you, is that I think so much else other than Palestinians have died in Gaza. The claims of the international rule of law, essentially the post 1945 world order has come crashing down in many ways. And I think, even though it might sound really counterintuitive, there's a way when we are muted, and this happens in, multiple contexts in my experience, right? Just in the daily ways that we are silenced as Palestinians, how our very presence becomes a kind of burden on people because of what we force people to be thinking of, to be reckoning with. And one of the things I'm always thinking about is, how is it that a people who are so oppressed and so lacking in any kind of state-backed power, such a source of deep and profound fear and threat. And I think these are moments when you go back to the lessons of Edward Said. And for me, what Edward Said taught me most powerfully was that the reason that people construct the other is so that they can define themselves. And I feel like what Palestinians make clear to these states and powers in, Western Europe and North America, it makes clear the depth of their own, not just complicity, but the depth of their own really brutality in valuing certain lives over other lives.
Absolutely.
Like it's
You're
like a
striking. You're
window,
striking.
it's like a reflection for them,
Yeah.
it's like a mirror.
You're making me like want to say more, but I'm gonna stop here because we have only a few more minutes, and I really want to credit you and thank you very much for being the first person in the past almost 100 broadcasts of Gaza in context to say the word poop. So
I can do it, but
no, no, شاطرة. Okay, all right. So let's move to the last term, concept, idea, people, that is Palestine. So, or Palestinians. In about 5 minutes, which is impossible. If you can tell us what have we learned in the past year about Palestinians.
I'm going to change it a little bit to reframe it to say what Palestinians have taught us. And I think one of I have five lessons. One is the way that in the face of all this death, Palestinians have shown us real lessons on life, on how to cherish it, even in the midst of this relentless horror and these sort of very small acts of intimacy and love and care that we've all seen. We're not just seeing the genocide live streamed, we're also seeing all of the multiple ways that Palestinians care for each other in the midst of all of this horror. Second, I think that Palestinians have and continue to invite us to imagine freedom, and imagine it sort of against and beyond the framework of national territorial sovereignty. I think that when you see people in this kind of context, in this, sustaining essentially a force of annihilation, it's a real invitation to think about, well, what do we imagine freedom to be? third, I think, and this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, which is, what does the experience of being colonized and dispossessed and subject to genocide, what does that experience do to your own experience of time? Because you live in a time that is elongated, at the same time that it's paralyzed. It's sort of a time that's always deferred. And I think, one of the things that Palestinians have taught us for a long time, but continue to teach us in these periods of in this last now well over a year of genocide, is how do we plan not for the future but despite it. And this is something that I think is important for all of us to think about, in terms of how do we even think about salvation, be it secular or messianic. And I think, and this is something that, Indigenous studies teaches us too, which is that we live in the dystopia that our ancestors imagined. And so I think Palestinians teach us that we are actually in the apocalypse, that we don't need to wait for it, and that we have to find ways to plan, again, not for but despite the future. Fourth, I think Palestinians have and continue to craft telling stories. And this is a tradition of storytelling that Palestinians have been doing historically, not as a way of reflecting history, but as a way of shaping it. And here, Hannah Sleiman, I've been quoting her since the beginning of this genocide, where she sort of has taught me to think about storytelling as a historiographic craft, as a method. And of course, so many of us have thought really deeply about the lessons of Rosemary Sayegh, who always reminds us that telling our stories is a way to live despite catastrophe, to perceive the world and act towards it. And I want to also really follow here Mesna Khatul, who has implored us recently to, quote, greet the Palestinians of Gaza, mourn with them, help carry some of their burdens, demand accountability for every loss, pick up the shards of memory and history that remain, and regather an archive of the disappeared. The only way to lose Gaza is to stop listening to the Palestinians of Gaza. End of quote. It's a quote from Mesna Khatul. I think most of all that Palestinians teach us that even amidst this living in and among ruins, and we know that this rubble in Gaza, it's been estimated it will take 15 years to clear the rubble. And I think, there have been many theorists and scholars who have invited us to think of life among the ruins. And here Palestinians are living among the ruins. And even in that, they are demanding that we perceive our abundance of movements, our abundance of ideas and practices. They demand of us that we do not give in to the logic of lack, of unlivability, or even to the language of dehumanization. We cannot give in to that language, because I think we have to keep very closely the lessons that Palestinians in the Gaza Strip teach us about imagining life, about birthing it, about sheltering it, even in this new stage of the Nakba. And I think, watching Palestinians in the Gaza Strip wrest life from death, hope from despair, and cohesion from fragments really demands of us to understand and reside and accompany these people, particularly in their grief, and to understand that this grief is a portal through time and place. And here I'll just end with a directive brought to us by Musab Abu Toha, who translates his friend Akram Surani, who quote says to us, quote, leave the door to the tent ajar and put a dish of lentil soup on the floor. The kids could wake up from their graves hungry at any time. It's very hard to ponder and envision what happens next. I think for the time being, we must be prepared for things to get worse. I think that, so many of us had thought that whatever would happen in Rafah was sort of the red line. And now we see northern Gaza, we see the 17th day of extermination, we see basically these death marches in complete impunity and, Israeli impunity and the silence of the so-called international community. We see Israel's quote unquote de-escalation, escalation for de-escalation that they're conducting in Lebanon. We see the massive destruction they're wreaking in Lebanon. And I think that whatever happens next is going to require immense vigilance and continued mobilization in our struggle for freedom, both in Palestine and Lebanon and far beyond.
Thank you so much, Sherene. I have noted so much of what you have been sharing, like I try to do with everyone else. I really appreciate your effort over the past year to educate us. I'm one of the people who follow you very closely and always learn so much from what you say about the same thing, because you were hesitant to do this, saying, what is it that I have not said? And it's very illuminating every time I hear you speak at an analytical level, but also at a much more profound human level.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you so much.
giving so many of us spaces to think and grieve together and imagine different ways of being.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherene. We will be speaking with you soon, and I hope that you continue to do the work you're doing. شكرا كتير, Sherene. I cannot
شكرا
thank you
لك.
and everyone else enough, and thanks to everybody who's joining us. Assalamu alaikum. Bonsoir.
سلام.